Hey there, it's Poul Mark, back with you with episode number 6 of the Transcend Coffee video blog. And you'll notice that today in my hand I do not have coffee. In fact, I have a glass of wine, and not only that, but we're on location at a local sort of boutique wine store here in Edmonton called Bin 104. My friend Bill Tanazichuk, who owns the store, gave us permission to come over here and shoot on location, because today we want to talk to you about tasting. And so I thought, let's go on to a different location. Let's go somewhere else, and let's try to talk about taste in maybe a creative way. And as any of you know that sort of follow this and follow some of the coffee talk, you'll know that a lot of comparisons are made between wine and coffee. We use a lot of the same vocabulary when it comes to describing the flavors and the aromas that we find in wine and in coffee. And so there's a lot of crossover. I think there's a lot of dissimilarity as well, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But the real focus of this show today is talking about taste and how we taste. And I want to steal a little bit, sort of take a little bit away from Thompson Owen. He's the founder of Sweet Maria's, and he did a video a little while ago, a couple months ago, on tasting. And he was sitting at his tasting table, a cupping table at his shop, and just did this sort of fun little video on taste, and I thought it was very instructive. And so I'm going to steal his sort of cue just to talk about taste in the most basic of senses, because I think it's the starting point. And when we do coffee tastings at the shop, this is what I tell the customers all the time, is that tasting really is simply a matter of paying a little bit of attention to what it is that goes in your mouth. And so I've got a glass of wine in front of me. It's a Syrah Cab blend. It's out of South Africa. It's called the Ruins. It's a 2008. And without getting too crazy about trying to describe the aromas and the flavors that are in this glass, because it's really not about the wine, it's about the process of tasting, I want to just illustrate sort of the main difference between drinking and tasting. Because when we drink wine, we simply do this. We swallow. And that process that I just did there, where I took a little sip of wine, took less than a second, and I had a sensation in my mouth of something being wet, having a wine-ish flavor in my mouth, and I swallowed it and it was gone. And so there's not a lot going on in terms of sensory perception when we drink like that. When we're not mindful of what we do, when we're not mindful of the process and stop and pay a little bit of attention, drinking becomes a sort of functional thing that we do to hydrate our bodies, or maybe in the case of drinking too much wine, dehydrate our bodies. But regardless, it becomes a functional activity. Tasting, on the other hand, is something that should be more than a functional thing. It should be something that stimulates our palate. It should be something that excites our imagination, that allows us to understand, come to grips with a new perception and new flavors, new aromas. It should be a bit of an adventure, and that maybe sounds a little bit overdone, overblown, but in all reality, it doesn't need to be. I think that if we would just stop and pay attention to what we eat, to what we drink, and start to taste, you'll be amazed at how much more exciting and how much more interesting life becomes, and how much more eating and drinking becomes much more of an enjoyable thing, rather than just this thing where you feed your body and hydrate your body. So to demonstrate a simple way of tasting, I'm going to show you just how I think you should just taste at a very basic level. And that's the major difference. That swallow took about 2 seconds, maybe 2.5 seconds. But in between the time I put it to my lips, I stopped and I swished the liquid around in my mouth. I let it coat my tongue and the roof of my palate. And that all of a sudden allows us to experience a much more broad and much more dynamic flavor and aroma than I did the previous time. I was able to get sort of ripe cherries out of this, some maybe raspberry, maybe a little bit of chocolate, but it's really, that's as simple as it gets in terms of just changing the way you consume or drink and become more aware of what's going through your mouth. And when it comes to coffee, we obviously go a step further. When last video, we talked a little bit about, we showed you the cupping process, and we talked about cupping. And we walked you through the various stages of how we cup coffee, and the dry aroma and the wet aroma, and breaking the crust, and evaluating all the flavors. And so what last week I didn't really show you was the flavor wheel. I made reference to it. hopefully you can see this. We'll zoom out, we'll cut away, and we'll do something with it. But essentially, we've got the Coffee Taster's flavor wheel. In all honesty, it's a bit antiquated. It's old technology, if we can even call it technology. On this side of the equation, we've essentially got sort of a descriptor of a bunch of aromas. And on this side here, on this side of the wheel, we've got tastes. And on this side of the wheel, we've got aromas. And you'll see that the tastes on this side are broken down into four main categories: bitter, salt, sweet, and sour. That's old. That's just not even good science anymore. We know it's bunk. It's been bunk for literally 100 years, 200 years. I don't know why we persist in describing taste, our ability to taste in these four categories. We know now that umami is a fifth category. There's a savory flavor that we're able to discern with our taste buds. We used to map our tongue out, and we had the tongue map, and we'd say, oh, sweet was on top, and salt was on the tip, and sour on the sides. That's all bunk too. We know that every taste bud that exists in our mouth and even into our esophagus is capable of perceiving every flavor. So what's interesting though for me is that when we're talking about this flavor wheel, we've got five basic tastes, and yet the aroma side of that wheel was far more complex, and that's really a very inadequate description as well in terms of the kind of aromas that we can get off coffee. And one of the great things that excites me about our human body and how we're designed and how we're created is that our olfactory bulb is this sort of protrusion of nerve endings that comes out of our brain with what they say is 340 nerve receptors that essentially are designed. It's the only place in our body where nerve endings actually protrude from our brain. But we have this amazingly complex ability to perceive aroma. And I might link to some videos by Dr. Cree. I was in Atlanta in April, and Dr. Cree was there talking about aroma and taste. He's an expert in this area, and it's amazing to me. It's really interesting about all the ways that we smell and all the ways we perceive. But the bottom line is that we all can perceive quite adequately. The human body is roughly equal in terms of its ability to perceive aroma and flavor. Some of us have a hypersensitivity to a few things, and some of us are a little bit deficient in other things. But for the most part, we all taste and smell about the same. And that's not, you know what I mean. Anyways, but one of the things that we have difficulty with, so perception isn't the issue when it comes to tasting. What's the issue is recognition. We have a very difficult time recognizing what we smell. And we've all been there. You've all done it. You've drank something, smelled something, and go, oh, that's, it's on the tip of my tongue. And you can't remember what that is. And essentially what we do in tasting is we hardwire our brains, those of us that transcend and those of us that taste for a living, we begin to hardwire our brains with a vocabulary and with memory paths that allow our brain to recognize what it's perceiving. And so when it comes back to this board, essentially what we're doing is we're memorizing all these descriptors, this vocabulary, and we're starting to remember the aroma and linking it to a word. And that's really all that it's about. So much like a muscle, the more you use it, the better it gets. And so what I would encourage you to do when it comes to tasting and perceiving aroma and flavor is pay attention. When you're in the grocery store walking by, pick up the green pepper, smell the green pepper, and go, oh, wow, yeah. Or the kiwi, or the lychee fruit, or whatever it is you've got in front of you, pay attention. Or when you're drinking something, don't just swallow it, drink it. Swish it around in your mouth and try to pay attention to what it is that you're tasting and smelling, because your life will be more rich, more exciting, and you'll just get better as you go along. I think that's probably it for today. I'm sure I could go on and on about tasting, and I don't want to bore you with it. I think though that it's just an interesting comparison. We're here in a wine store today with a little bit of wine and comparing and contrasting to coffee. Maybe we need to do another episode on comparing and contrasting coffee and wine and sort of showing the differences that exist between the two. But regardless of what it is, I encourage you to just stop and take a little bit of time as you eat and as you drink so that you can allow your body to do what it was intended to do what it was made to do, and that's perceive the aromas and the flavors that make eating and drinking that much more exciting, that much more pleasurable. So until next time, episode 7, I'll say cheers, and hope you enjoy this.